Hi, this is Ms. Wong, and we're taking notes today on transport across membranes, or how the cell membrane regulates the movement of materials into and out of cells. When we're thinking about the cell membrane, we want to remember that we are primarily concerned with how the cell membrane, through its structure, regulates the movement of molecules across that membrane. The membrane is what we call selectively permeable or semi-permeable. So that means that certain molecules can move across the membrane and others can't. When we think about membranes in cells, we can envision a cell as being completely surrounded by a cell membrane. However, we also want to remember that organelles also have membranes. So some of the organelles that we've learned about already, like the mitochondria, the chloroplasts, the nucleus, all of those organelles are also surrounded by membranes. So that means that those membranes can also control the movement of molecules in and out of organelles. All membranes are made in the cell of a bilayer made out of phospholipids. We've actually talked about phospholipids before, way back in the biomolecules section. We talked about lipids or fats, and we represented our fats with this simple shape. Phospholipids are simply another type of fat or another type of lipid. They are shaped a little bit differently. So in phospholipids, we have a phosphate head, and that head is hydrophilic, so that means that it's attracted to water. The fatty acid tail, on the other hand, is hydrophobic, so that means that that tail part of the molecule is repelled by water. Because of these two features of a phospholipid, when phospholipids form cell membranes, the cell membrane is arranged as a bilayer. This is because both inside and outside of the cell there's water. So the phosphate heads, or the hydrophilic heads, are attracted to the water both inside and outside of the cell, and the fatty acid tails are then protected from the water by those hydrophilic heads. This is a great example of structure and function where the structure of the cell membrane enables that cell membrane to perform its function. There are some characteristics of cell membranes that we want to keep in mind. That phospholipid bilayer has a bunch of embedded proteins in it, and we'll talk about how those proteins help molecules move into and out of cells. The entire cell membrane is also what we call semi-permeable, and the cell membrane can self-repair because it is fluid and flexible. So those phospholipids aren't fixed in place. Instead, you can think of them as things that are floating in a bunch of water, and they can move around each other, and therefore those proteins that are embedded in there can also move, and the entire membrane is very fluid and flexible. Here's just another example of the phospholipid bilayer again, looking at how the proteins can span the phospholipid bilayer. There are other components of cell membranes that we're not going to talk about right now. Let's move on to the two types of transport across a membrane. So there are two primary types, passive transport and active transport. So these are the ways that molecules can move across the cell membrane into or out of cells. In passive transport, the molecules move across the membrane without the use of energy. Passive transport involves diffusion, or molecules moving from high concentration to low concentration. We've talked about how diffusion happens simply through the random movement of molecules and molecules colliding with each other. There are two types of passive transport, simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, and we're going to talk about both of them. In simple diffusion, molecules simply move across the lipid bilayer on their own through very small holes between those phospholipids. So you can see here that simple diffusion is happening down the concentration gradient. In other words, molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The concentration gradient is simply the difference in concentration of molecules between two different spaces. So when molecules move down a concentration gradient, it means that they're moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The opposite of that molecules moving up the concentration gradient would be the opposite. It would be molecules moving from a low concentration to an area of high concentration. Simple diffusion happens when small nonpolar molecules pass through the lipid bilayer. So oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas both move into and out of cells through simple diffusion. They're just passing through small holes in between those phospholipids. On the other hand, facilitated diffusion requires a protein channel that allows specific materials across the membrane. These proteins facilitate or they help diffusion happen. So molecules are still moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, but they are being helped along by a channel protein. Some molecules that move through the cell membrane by facilitated diffusion are sugar, amino acids, both of those because they're rather large molecules, water because it's a polar molecule or it has a charge to it, as well as salts because salts have either a positive or a negative charge. You can see that in facilitated diffusion, again, molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, meaning they're moving down the concentration gradient. And facilitated diffusion requires a channel protein for large or polar molecules. In the top two examples, there are channel proteins that remain open all the time, so that means that those molecules can pass through at any time. There's also a type of facilitated diffusion that uses not a channel protein but a carrier protein, and that carrier protein changes shape when the molecule enters it. However, you can see that the molecule is still moving down the concentration gradient. So once again, facilitated diffusion is the diffusion through protein channels of specific molecules, and there's no energy needed. It's called facilitated diffusion because the protein channels are helping those molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. If we compare simple diffusion versus facilitated diffusion, we can see that in simple diffusion, molecules are simply passing through the lipid bilayer itself through small gaps, and this is just for those very small and nonpolar molecules like oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas. Whereas facilitated diffusion requires the presence of a channel protein, and it's happening to those larger or polar molecules like glucose, amino acids, and water. Moving on to active transport. So active transport is the movement of molecules across a membrane that requires additional energy by the cell. In other words, the cell needs to use ATP in order to push molecules across the membrane, and this usually happens because the cell is pushing molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So now the cell is trying to push molecules up the concentration gradient. Here's a model for active transport. Go ahead and take a moment to pause the slideshow and read the text that's underneath each picture. So you can see that ATP is required in this particular case because the ATP causes that protein carrier to change shape, enabling the cell to pump essentially the different molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. If we compare active versus passive transport doesn't require any energy because molecules are moving down the concentration gradient, whereas active transport does require energy because molecules are moving up the concentration gradient. Finally, here's a picture of all three types of transport on one picture. So our two types of passive transport are simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. And there's our active transport requiring an input of ATP energy. If you need to review any of these types of transports, please go back and listen to the slideshow again and be ready to talk about your ideas about transport across membranes in class. Thanks.